Hey everybody, welcome to another video, and if you watched one of my more recent videos, you'll know that I was talking about Final Cut and Logic finally coming to the iPad Pro, and other iPads in the case of Logic Pro. But I've been using Final Cut Pro now for a little while on the iPad just to get some experience with it. I've played around with my own footage, I've played around with the demo footage that Apple includes, and this is kind of going to stand as a first impressions video because there are a lot of things I feel like I could cover with this, but I need to spend more time using it to really get those things nailed down. But for now, I have three things I found that I really like about this version of Final Cut, and I have three things that I really don't like. So we're going to cover all of those today in this first impressions video, so let's dive in. And also, if this video looks a little different, it's because I am actually editing this entire video on the iPad after filming it in cinematic mode on my iPhone, for reasons we'll talk about here in a little bit. But let's dive in with this new version of Final Cut for everybody, or at least for iPad Pro users. So my experience with Final Cut has been a long and storied experience with Final Cut because I've been using it since Final Cut 7. I remember the transition to Final Cut 10 and how many things were missing, how many things need to be improved on, and they were improved on, and they've been very well covered over the years that Final Cut has been on version 10 point whatever. But in this version of Final Cut, this is the first time that Apple has made it touch focused. And this is the first thing that I actually really like, which I wasn't expecting to like. But here's why I like it so much. See, because when I think of companies who have taken software that is mouse and keyboard centric and have tried to convert it to touch, like Windows, I always think that it's compromised in some way and that there are things that you just need a mouse and keyboard for that aren't really accounted for. But I haven't really found that to be the case here with this new touch implementation. I mean, don't get me wrong, they've done some of the more bog standard stuff like making all the icons bigger and easier to touch, which is something to be expected when you're making an entire interface to fit on a 12.9-inch display. But they've done other things too, my favorite of which is the frame-by-frame scroll wheel that they added. It looks a lot like the zoom wheel on the iPhone's camera, so it's a familiar piece of the interface, but it's used in a totally new way. This, along with all of the other little things that have been added or changed to accommodate touch, means that you could actually edit an entire video on this iPad using only the touch interface. I've done little cuts here and there with videos that I've been playing around with that have only been done with the touchscreen, and it is actually very possible. I have been surprised by how doable it actually is, but it's just little things like that that really show that when Apple was trying to make it touch focused, they weren't just going to cut out things that weren't really needed for touch and not give you an option for, going frame by frame, for example. You could do that with the mouse and keyboard, or in this case with the arrow keys, but if you don't have a set of arrow keys, how are you going to do it? Well, here's your scroll wheel. It's a super nice touch, and all of the little interface changes when it comes to making it touch-friendly have been pretty intuitive. Obviously, there are some things that are missing. We'll talk about that more in a little bit, but for the things that are there, which is a lot more than you'd expect, at least more than I expected, it is an extremely nice conversion to touch. But the second thing that I really like is the fact that if you do have a mouse and keyboard, it's going to be very familiar to anybody who's used Final Cut on the Mac in the past decade, because everything that you would expect to kind of be there is there. My favorite of which is the fact that you can have a secondary playhead to find a section in the video without having to drag the entire playhead. This is such a minor thing, but when it comes to editing on the iPad, every other tool I've used has had you scroll the entire timeline forward or backward when you want to move to a different section, instead of just letting you find it and then click on it, which is how I have been used to doing it on Final Cut for years at this point. Like, don't get me wrong, DaVinci Resolve and LumaFusion have been incredible powerhouse editors on the iPad, and really, that is the only thing that's really irritated me with both of those editors, is the drag and drop timeline as opposed to being able to find your spot in the video with a cursor first. That is just something that I have gotten into such a habit of using in Final Cut that hasn't existed on the iPad, and I was so glad that they implemented that. But there's other things too, like key commands, which is a must for me. They work perfectly, and I have only found 2 or 3 different key commands that weren't carried over, And I feel like that's mostly because the feature that they were a part of hasn't been implemented yet, which is something that we'll talk more about later. But you got a mouse and keyboard, it's going to feel right at home for the most part. And I really like that. Now, the third thing I really like on this iPad is kind of a double-edged sword, but it's the simplicity of the interface while still giving you a lot of powerful tools. Like I say, it's a double-edged sword because I can think of a few key things that aren't here yet that I use regularly on the desktop version of Final Cut, like compound clips, where implementing that in a touch-first way could potentially be pretty difficult, if not impossible, and would require a mouse and keyboard. So I'll be curious to see how Apple will pull that off. However, other more difficult or more advanced tools that you would find on the desktop version did get converted over really well to this version of Final Cut. Multicam comes to mind. That is a really good implementation of multicam, and it's honestly easier on this than it was even on the desktop. So time will tell, but I feel like the simplicity at the moment is a very good thing for the tools that are currently available. But as things start to get added to it, it might become a little more complicated. But overall, for everything I've talked about, these were the things that really stood out to me with this version of Final Cut that were extremely good. The quality of life improvements on this, the touch-first focus, all of those things are extremely nice, and I'm very impressed considering that when Apple said that it was going to be touch first and all these things, I was expecting a very parsed down version of Final Cut. But we did get a lot more than I was expecting, and, well, that's always nice. But now the niceties are over, let's dive into the three things that I really, really don't like with this that I hope get improved. Number one is the lack of complexity. I know I just said as the last thing I really like that the simplicity is good, and it is good, don't get me wrong. I love the simplicity, but just like how they have a simple and advanced mode for programs like Logic on the Mac, I feel like we should have an option like that in this version of Final Cut where we can hook up a keyboard and mouse and get a more advanced version. Because I've said it before, and I'll say it again, Final Cut runs fantastically on an M1 chip. And these iPads are using M1 chips. So there is no reason why Apple couldn't implement some version of this tool that just goes into a more advanced version when it detects that a mouse and keyboard is present. So while I like the simplicity, it lacks complexity in areas that I, as a professional editor, need. That was one of the big things for me that I noticed when playing around with this, and it was quite a bit of a learning curve to almost simplify your own methods to really give you the most out of this tool. It's sort of a backwards way of thinking, but to get the most out of this version of Final Cut, you have to go backwards and do less than what you think you have to do if you're coming from the desktop version. It's really weird. The second thing I really don't like about this version of Final Cut is its lack of support for third-party plugins. Now, Apple said that they will be adding it sometime in the near future, which is great. That is something that this desperately needs. That's something that I desperately need. It's the reason why in the beginning of the video I said that I will be editing as much of this video as I can on my iPad, because most of the elements that you see when it comes to the punch zooms or my end title cards, or if you watch covers and commentary, my opening title cards, all of those are plugins, and none of those are available on this iPad at the time of recording. I'm sure they will be at some point soon. I am waiting for that moment, but at the moment, it's not supported, which means that if I were to fully just move everything over and do it on my iPad, I would be missing a ton of stuff, and that sucks. And the third thing, and this is a deal breaker for me, straight up deal breaker, is the lack of external drive support for Final Cut. I cannot use this version of Final Cut without external drive support. Let me explain. I've talked about this in other videos, particularly in the videos where people complain about the speeds of internal SSDs on current Macs, but when it comes to video editing, all of my work is put on an external drive, not only for data security, but ease of transport, and for the fact that in the case that my Mac dies, I still have everything somewhere else. The only thing I use internal storage for on any of my computers is for storing the programs that I use and keeping things that are required to be on the internal drive, or, sometimes for convenience, but most of the time it's necessity and applications. All my Final Cut Pro projects are saved on an external piece of storage media, and all of my finished projects are exported to a massive storage drive and then backed up to another massive storage drive. You can't do that on this version of Final Cut. If I plug in an external drive and I select a file from that external drive, it imports it directly onto the iPad. And because I had no hope in the world of ever getting Final Cut on this iPad, I went with the smallest storage option because I had already given up on the possibility of Final Cut coming to the iPad. And now here we are. But my iPad having a smaller internal drive really shouldn't matter because LumaFusion implemented external drive support and it works extremely well. And DaVinci Resolve even has external drive support, and it had it at launch. The fact that Final Cut has some of the best external drive support on the Mac, letting me put files and libraries wherever I want, the fact that it has that and it wasn't brought over to the iPad is kind of infuriating. And it also doesn't make any sense considering that you need an M1 processor to run this version of Final Cut, which is fair. But then you got to consider that the M1 versions of the iPads include the iPad Air, which has a 64 gigabyte SSD base. Like, I have over 100 gigs left, so I can do one project at a time here in Final Cut, and it's really not going to be the end of the world. But a lot of the footage that I have used for bigger projects have exceeded 50 gigs or more. So the fact that I have to put it on my iPad directly kind of makes no sense. And you can't use the excuse that, oh, it's because the internal SSD is faster, because I've shown in multiple videos, I did an entire scientific breakdown of it, but I've proved in other videos that the speeds required for the footage that I use in Final Cut is a fraction of the maximum speed that these drives are capable of. So no, it's not a drive speed issue. It's just we didn't implement it because we want to implement a touch-friendly version, and I guess Apple doesn't want a drive just kind of hanging off the iPad, because I guess if that happens, it won't look good in publicity photos. I don't know. It really frustrates me, though. I really hope that they add external drive support. I am super looking forward to when they finally add third-party plugin support, and really, I do hope that we get some kind of advanced user feature in the future, because the actual interface is good. And that's the thing that really kills me, is I was very impressed with the interface that we were given with this version of Final Cut. I was not anticipating anything on this level, and we got quite a good piece of software, in my opinion. But it's lacking enough features that I just can't use it yet as a full replacement for the desktop version. It's just not viable for me. But if you're a beginner, the simplicity might be super useful for you. And if you don't want to spend the money on the keyboard and mouse, the touch interface is great. It is one of the best implementations of a touch-first editor I've seen in a very long time. And of course, you do have features available on the mouse and keyboard, just not as many as I personally would have hoped for. At the end of the day, I think that the implementation that they have here on the iPad for Final Cut is a step in the right direction. I think that what is here is extremely good, and I think that what could be added might make this a more usable tool. But at the time of recording, what it's missing keeps it from being a useful tool for me. I would love to have a secondary option as an editor that I can take on the go with me, and without buying a MacBook Pro, that's not really an option. So hopefully they add the things that I said I didn't like, and hopefully the things that are here that I do like just keep getting improved upon. And no, I don't really mind the price, because I think that $50 for a year is not bad. And that's why I didn't make the list of things I love or hate. But either way, that's been it. Let me know what you all think down in the comments below. Is this a tool, if you have an iPad that can run it, that you would want to use, or do you really not care? Is iMovie good enough? Because I'm sure some people will feel that way. Or do you use another alternative like DaVinci Resolve or LumaFusion? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, as always, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. I have a video coming up on Friday. It is going to be the Ultimate Switch comparison, so make sure to subscribe or at least keep an eye out for it. Aside from that, I'll see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there and have a good one.